We forget that medicine itself is a story about the body and how bodies work and what makes them healthy and sick. And that story changes every 2 years. In medicine, we lack a sense of history. And so we pretend that the story that's current has always been current and will always be current. But if one looks at time, for instance, if you look at the recommendations to prevent heart disease, they change every 2 years. And if you followed them and changed them every 2 years, you would drive yourself absolutely bananas. You'd be nutty. We do need to be aware that in every moment we humans are creating a map of the world that isn't necessarily the world, but it's our story about how things should work. And the one thing we're pretty sure of is things never work the way they're supposed to work. So probably the story will have flaws, and we'll have to find those flaws and plug them up or revise the story or change the story. There's the data, which is often enigmatic and difficult to make sense of. And then there's the spin that we put on the data, that we need. We have to fit it into our worldview and make sense of it somehow. That worldview is itself a story. And what do we do all day but we listen to patients tell us their stories? And then we tell them our story about their story. And of course, if they don't agree with our story, we call them non-compliant or non-adherent or stupid or resistant or recalcitrant or any number of other adjectives, because of course we know everything. And what I love, there's a marvelous quote in a book written in 1850s about the Cherokee and their healing practices. And it's talking about how these savage people stick thorns into points on people's bodies and twist them, thinking that these thorns, if they're twisted, will release energy blocks to allow healing to take place, when every fool knows that the proper treatment is to bleed the patient with leeches. So, regardless of what story we have, we're equally arrogant in every epoch about how our stories are the only stories and they're the right stories and everyone should listen to us. There's a lot of ways to explain things, and they don't have to overlap. They don't have to fit into one another. They can be radically different, and we don't actually have to make them make sense to each other. That we can say, okay, here are these different stories about how to interpret what just happened. And an example I like is in traditional North American spirituality. There's all kinds of stories about how things are supposed to be. And there's the spiritual story, and sometimes there's the practical story. So in my father's tribe, the Lakota, all ceremonial spaces tend to face east. And there's marvelous stories about how new spirits enter in the east and walk around the earth to the south, to the west, to the north, and then they exit back into spirit world from the east gate. And there's also the practical side, which is that the wind in Lakota country blows from the west. And so it's kind of good to have your door facing east because you'll be out of the wind. So in a certain mindset, you might say, well, the physical story negates the spiritual story. But if you're practicing explanatory pluralism, you would say, well, they're equally valid and they're equally true. It's like one elder in Australia told us that there are more than 400 creation stories in Australia, and they're all true. And so Australian elders are like North American elders, and so we knew to wait and say, how so, Uncle? And he said, well, they're all true in the place where they're told for the people who tell them. And I just thought that was beautiful. I hang on to that because, there's all kinds of stories. They're true where they're told for the people who tell them.